Coming up in this week's episode of TechSNAP, since the very beginning of this show, one theme keeps coming to light. A new age of cyber warfare has already begun. In this week's episode, we'll cover what targets hackers or foreign governments might want to target to wage cyber warfare. Plus, we'll cover interesting details about attacks that have already happened that we're just now learning the repercussions of. All that and more in this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. My name is Chris, and joining me on Skype, like always, is my co-host Alan. Hey there, Alan. How you doing?
Hey, Chris. I'm good.
Hey, buddy. It's lucky episode number 13. Mm-hmm. And if you tuned in last week, you know that we've been planning to cover cyber warfare in this episode. Now, this episode was shot live July 7th, and it is our 13th episode, like I mentioned. And we thought lucky number 13 deserved a pretty heavy topic. And so we've kind of assembled a story here that we will lead you through by example. We'll cover some different angles of cyber warfare because, well, let's be honest, cyber warfare can be a lot of things. It can have a lot of different definitions.
Yeah, it has a very broad definition. And so I thought we could talk about some of the different forms it could take and what effects those might have on you personally and your life and your business and so on.
Yeah, and if you've been following us since the start, I think you'll recognize a lot of stories that have been covered here on TechSNAP have sort of been having overall themes that lead to different conclusions that I think we're going to have fun exploring in this episode. So stay tuned for that. But because this is going to be our dedicated cyber warfare episode, that means no Q&A this week. But next week, we're going to give you a double dose of Q&A. So send your questions in and your feedback to techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com. Yes. What do you think, Alan? Oh, and of course, we should mention, too, the Reddit page over at...
yes, the Reddit page supplied a lot of the leads to the stories we end up covering this week.
Yeah, and we want to give credit to where credit's due, so attributions given in the show notes for those Redditors. And so if you liked that story, you can go over to their profile and follow them on Reddit and maybe see some of the other things that they have submitted. So check out the Reddit page too, and if you can always submit questions that way as well, it's a great way to have other people sort of chime in and maybe vote up, and we can see popular questions. So you can get to that by going to links.techsnap.tv or find it on Reddit. All right, Al. Now, why don't we begin our dig into cyber warfare with probably the types of attacks that would have the largest impact on countries and economies and things like that. And of course, that's cyber warfare attacks on governments. And this is obviously a direction cyber warfare is already going, and it's already happening. Yes. And we've seen things like Stuxnet, and Stuxnet is a perfect example of a cyber warfare weapon. But it happens on all kinds of scales, and you have a pretty good example here. I'll let you cover it.
Yeah. Well, you know, our first example was that the hacktivist group Anonymous went after the Turkish government and broke into their network of websites and took out about 100 government websites. Hacktivists attacking governments. Yeah. And so in this case, it's not actually a government versus a government, but it's when it's targeted at a government, it's still cyber warfare.
Yeah, and it still impacts the nation of that government,
right? As
much as any other attack would.
You know, attacks like this can affect the government in a lot of ways. For example, in Canada, most businesses do their online tax filing on a government website.
Oh, sure.
If somebody, even just a denial of service attack or whatever, to take that website offline, it could disrupt the government's income, right? Like sales tax paid monthly by all these businesses is all done online.
Yeah.
Or, you know, it can affect other things, like even just people's access to information about the weather, right? Environment Canada issues the forecasts, like even most radio and TV stations are just rebroadcasting information given to them by Environment Canada, right?
You can cause little pockets of chaos is essentially it. You know, you can take down...
Well, and if you could take down 100 sites at once, you can cause a lot of chaos.
Yeah, absolutely.
But specifically, if you could take out, you know, if you can target more infrastructure type things like, you know, command and control, or even just traffic lights, or power generation, or oil pipelines, and anything like that.
Well, let's take Stuxnet, for example. It was revealed that they actually ended up having to do some rolling blackouts due to some of their nuclear power plants not able to generate enough power to meet demand. So let's extrapolate that to...
And Stuxnet was only targeted at the centrifuges.
Yeah.
It wasn't even meant to cripple the whole.
Right, but because of whatever, either by their action to shut down and try to repair, or because of the nature of bringing them so out of whack, they ended up suffering to some degree rolling blackouts. And you could extrapolate that same kind of attack.
You know, if your power plant's infected with a virus, you kind of take it offline just to be safe, right? You don't want it to melt down or.
I would hope so,
exactly.
But you can find the code to Stuxnet now online. It's being reverse engineered already, and it can be retargeted to something that it would impact. It doesn't have to be. A power plant that's over in the Middle East. It can be a power plant in North America. It can be a power plant in anywhere in Europe. It
can be an oil refinery, a pipeline.
If you just knocked out power to one area, and like, for example, what happened here last year in my hometown when we lost power for 4 days, our gas stations, some of them had power pumps, generators, but most of them didn't. The ones that did, well, they ran out of gas. And then no one had gas. We literally ran out of fuel services for our vehicles, and things came to a stop. And that was just from a storm.
When people needed that fuel to run their generators to make
that didn't require
vital services running.
That didn't require rebuilding an IT infrastructure and purging some sort of massive infection and tracking it back. That just required cutting up logs and retying lines back together. You know what I mean? And it took 4 days. So you can see how an attack on a government, even different aspects of services, and something as large as a government is so huge that it's hard to sort of have one cohesive security strategy too. So there's going to be soft spots.
Well, especially, for example, things like oil refineries aren't owned by the government in most countries. And so if you were to able to disrupt one of those enough to affect the supply of fuel in an area, then you can cause all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
Or with the power grid, a lot of things that have to be redundant draw their power from multiple different parts of the grid so that if there's a regular blackout, they're not affected. But if you know which two areas they affect and you have the ability to damage the power grid, you can take out those two areas and cause all offsite power to be lost to a certain thing, like a power plant, right? Like we saw what happened in Japan when the power plants lost access to offsite power.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, we sure did.
If you could combine that in some way to take out their offsite power and then, deny them the ability to get more fuel for their generators, then they would go offline.
Well, and back to this Turkish, this hack that happened from Anonymous, one of the results wasn't even a disruption of services, but just a violation of the citizens' privacy. Didn't they end up leaking citizens' information onto the Pirate Bay or something like that?
Well, on the Pirate Bay, they posted an archive that contains the complete content of all the sites.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if there's any personal information included in that, but they have all the content of all the sites in an archive on the Pirate Bay.
It just seems like that would be such...
Then they destroyed most of the sites or defaced them so that, they show up with some message saying, haha, the Turkish government is owned or whatever.
Yeah.
And specifically, they also managed to lock the administrators out of the system so that they can't even take the websites down or get rid of the defacements, to the point where they've had to just turn the websites completely off now.
Wow.
So a number of the sites you can't connect to them anymore.
Do you remember that story? I think it was from San Francisco, where an IT admin refused to hand over the
admin passwords.
Admin passwords, yeah. And so he sort of essentially had the city on hostage he ended up going to jail for that.
Yes.
But that is just one example. When you take away the credentials, then oh boy. Any other areas you want to cover on this one?
Well, a couple of things. A number of the sites that were targeted appear to be hospitals or other medical facilities.
Oh, that's a shame.
Again, that could cause problems.
Yeah.
And in a cyber warfare type of situation, taking out critical government services can be very disruptive.
Yeah. Especially when you have people that are dependent on it.
Yeah, and it actually covers... do the story slightly out of order, but the next one is there were in July of 2009 and March of 2011 there were attacks on the South Korean government websites. And so
yes, I remember. I read this story. This is one of the few I read this week. That
the attacks on the Republic of Korea's government websites were drills done by the DPRK, the North Korean government.
Yeah, so the North Korean government ran war drills on the South Korean government.
And, well, part of it was, reconnaissance, right? You probe the defenses and see how vulnerable they are. How easy can we get in? How much havoc can we cause just with this,
Right.
And you need that kind of information to develop a real plan for, all right, when we do go to war with South Korea, because that's, always technically South Korea and North Korea are still at war. They don't actually have a peace treaty, just a ceasefire. And that's all they've had for 50 plus years. And, we've seen a couple of times where they start trading shots, right? That was, it was earlier this year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And selling and stuff.
You got to believe that various different governments are doing things to get essentially reconnaissance on each other. Yeah.
Yeah, develop plans for, all right, so if we ever do go to war, we're going to instantly, trigger off these events and try to, at the least, make things more difficult for the enemy.
Well, and something to keep in mind too is a government, say, let's just go with China because that's a popular one to pick on. Mm-hmm. A government like China doesn't even have to actively hack. I mean, they can just sit back when Anonymous releases this stuff or when different groups release stuff on torrent. They can just sit here and collect different people's credentials, and then they can go do things like log into their Gmail account and then go further from there. I mean, they can benefit from all of this stuff just by data mining it.
Yep.
So it's,
and that's one of the hardest things about cyber warfare is sometimes with these hacks, we don't know whether it's just some person, some hacktivist group, or if it's a government-sponsored attack.
Right.
So the South Korean attacks, it probably just reconnaissance to allow the North Koreans to build a plan for what they would do to disrupt the South's command and control and their ability to communicate with their citizens and all kinds of things like that. But also, much of the attack against South Korea came from within South Korea.
Oh, really?
And the way they managed to do this, it's speculated that they made a couple of viruses and put them up on popular file-sharing websites in South Korea. And using the resulting botnet of infected computers, they attacked the South Korean government's websites from inside South Korea.
Smart.
Right, because if they attacked them from computers in North Korea, it'd be easier to block. And North Korea doesn't actually have all that much of a presence on the internet.
That is pretty clever. I got to say, that's a good way to go.
Yeah.
Get them from the inside.
It's harder for them to, block external access and say, all right, we'll only let our own citizens access the website. But it's not their citizens knowingly doing it, but it's their citizens that are attacking their own websites.
Right. Wow. Jeez. Using spammer tactics, basically.
Yeah. And well, who has a better connection inside South Korea than people inside South Korea?
Yeah. Yeah, and if they have some sort of sophisticated monitoring and firewalling system for, the connections that go outside their country, and you just completely bypass those entirely, no worry at all.
Yeah.
Did you want to jump back up to the Florida story?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry,
this one is sort of a good example of, again, not disrupting services, but data mining or just, screwing with sort of innocent bystanders.
Yeah, well, this one also goes to show that, if it was this easy to get in now, it was probably just as easy back when the election was happening, right?
Yeah. So this is a story about the Florida election database, right? Getting compromised?
Yes, and so basically they leaked it through a paste bin, and you can go and look, and it has the name, username, and plaintext passwords for election workers and poll stations that were used to secure these electronic voting systems.
Oh, boy.
And the passwords are... So the username for each user is their first initial and their last name. It's not that uncommon.
No.
But their password is their first initial, their last initial, and then 4 numbers.
It's pretty simple. And it's that for everyone?
Yeah. And first of all, it's totally predictable because the first letter and the only 2 letters in it are from their name, right? One of the first rules of your password is it shouldn't be related to your username.
So this is being claimed by the as part of the anti-sec movement. So this is, boy, they're really moving right along.
Well, when you have a large group of people, you can just poke at everything until information falls in.
This is an honest-to-goodness hacktivism group that we've got going on here, and they're just wow. I mean, geez, you got to figure they're on somebody's radar big time.
Yeah, but if it's just an unorganized group of people doing it for the lulls, cause this much havoc. Imagine what an organized core of,
I know.
Specifically with cyber warfare, the things they break into likely don't want to report that they were broken into.
Well, and
right? If anything secret is hacked into, we're not going to hear about it.
You say this is a group of, if this the point you make, this is just a random group of people, and they have large numbers, but the numbers they have really in relative terms to like when a government thinks of troops, like we're, for example, coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, so like the total of the troops is like 100,000 or something like that, some insane large number, and that's just a part of them.
The U.S. deployment in South Korea is about 30,000.
So imagine if you took away the hobbyist sort of volunteer system, and you went to something more like this. The story here, and I know this is just in the roundup, but it just fits so well, I want to throw it in. But this is a story here about the South Korean Army has a university where they can get students to major in cyber defense, and then essentially they can be drafted into a cyber army. So their approach is sort of in numbers, but under their own control, like troops would be.
So in this case, it's for the first year, it'll be 30 undergraduate students. So people who already have a degree in computers that will be training in cyber defense and working as part of the military. And the U.S. already has something like this. The Air Force has a cyber command, who's, they train these people basically in offense and defense, and they're out there doing stuff.
I think what's sort of interesting about this approach, though, is this approach is going through the school system, right? Yeah. That's kind of interesting. Yeah. But you're right. We should point that out. The U.S. does have a cyber warfare, whatever. So,
and the reason you don't hear about it is because it's secret.
Right.
Right.
So, but think about what you could do if you had the numbers larger than anonymous under your complete control like that.
Well, and just people who are doing this for a living, right? They're doing this all day, every day, as opposed to,
and they're well trained.
These people are just doing this in their spare time.
They're well trained, and the other thing, you have to figure. I know we keep going
unlimited resources,
right? And I keep going back to Stuxnet, but it came out that Stuxnet took advantage of like 20 zero-day exploits, which is just. It almost seems like you would have to have inside knowledge, like to the bug tracker database or something, to take advantage of 20 zero-day exploits. And that's the kind of access that a governmental institution would have. And they could provide that over to their people that are doing the work. Yep. And then, it's not... See, the people doing the anti-sec movement have to go find the vulnerabilities and figure out how to exploit them. In fact, that's part of their fun. Yep. A government approach would be... We go coerce the company that we have a leverage over to give us the information we need, and then we focus fire, and know exactly how to exploit it. It could be much more precise and much more devastating, and also they would be able to, very likely, like in the case of Stuxnet, much more stealth. You wouldn't know.
They have this discipline so that when they break into things, they don't advertise the fact. They don't release the information. If they're quiet enough about it, nobody notices that they broke into this, and they can keep collecting data over time.
Yeah.
And possibly, if they broke into an outside-facing machine, it's like we talked about the other day, is if you hold on to that, you can escalate it, right? You can learn about the system and break your way further inside and get access to even more juicy details.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, when they break into some of these machines, they're being stealthy about it so that in the future they can launch attacks from those machines.
Right, just like they did in the botnet.
Or use those machines to cover their trails, like we'll talk about a little bit later.
Now, any other kind of framework you want to set up in the government section, or should we move on to the media section?
We can move on.
All right. So we'll wrap that up. That's sort of an example of cyber warfare against governments. But another very effective method would be to manipulate the public or manipulate the media.
So with the attacks on media, it's a lot like old-fashioned propaganda. Is if you can get data out there that seems reliable, or get people to believe things, and you have this control over them.
Yeah.
Right. And we saw things like this happen. A couple of years ago, Reuters accidentally published the obituary they keep for Steve Jobs on right? They always maintain it so that they have it if in case something happens.
Reuters
But they
also
accidentally-
slipping how creepy they are, but I guess, a lot of media institutions do this.
Yeah, and they accidentally published it, and in doing so caused Apple's stock price to nosedive.
Yeah.
And it turned out it was false, and it recovered. But if a series of things like this could have happened, then it can cause a real disruption.
Yeah, wasn't it just,
right.
it's been since the last episode that Fox News' Twitter account was hacked, and then they tweeted that Barack Obama had been assassinated.
Yep, and
So-
a couple weeks before that, LulzSec compromised the PBS News website and put up a bunch of fake stories.
Yeah.
In these cases, they were, not very believable. But, if they were done properly, they could have been. And, having a foreign power manipulate the stock market with great effect could cause huge damage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
And something that will always really affect the stock price of a company and its income is getting a major public hack like Sony. I mean, look what's happened to them just value-wise and expense-wise. They said something. They're saying they're slipping into the billions of costs now. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
And it's just the irreparable damage to their reputation.
Yeah.
And customer loyalty and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
And Tom Clancy wrote one of his novels, Debt of Honor, was about
Warfox in the chat room says that he believed that when he saw it, he believed that Obama had been assassinated, and he saw it on Twitter. A lot of people get their news like that's how I found out about Michael Jackson was dead, as I saw it on Twitter.
Exactly.
I honestly, if I saw that come across, I probably would immediately go like Google News search it.
Right, but it's simply, when Michael Jackson died, how many news websites were completely taken offline just by the inrush of traffic? Right?
Oh yeah.
So if in a coordinated strike, information like this leaks out across a couple mediums, and then all the other mediums that you might use to dispute it were taken offline by denial of service attacks, then you could do serious damage, right?
Yeah,
especially with things like you've seen CNN accidentally report things because they read it on Twitter and assumed it's true.
Yeah.
If you could do it just right.
I guess the other thing I could see, it would seem like if I were really if I wanted to do like recon or something like that, it would seem like getting access to a news network would be a really good way to sort of keep an eye on things and what's going on. And you really wouldn't even necessarily want to, I mean, you might have the option, but you wouldn't want to do anything nefarious other than just monitor.
Exactly. Just knowing news stories before they're actually published.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of times journalists get information from companies about upcoming products and stuff where they're under a gag order saying you can't publish this until this date or whatever. But if you break into their website and can see draft versions of their articles, you might get information that you could even just use it for insider trading on the stock market.
Or, again, going back to if it is it could, honestly, is it still cyber warfare if it's your own government attacking one of your own corporations so that way they could get the name of an informant? Is that still cyber warfare? Or what is that?
Maybe not, but kind of. It's hard to say. It depends on
it's
your
a government
definition of
attacking a
cyber warfare.
corporation.
Right.
I don't understand. I don't know how that would work exactly, but I could foresee where, say, the U.S. government might want to know who was an informant for the New York Times. Why not just go in and get that terrorist? You know what I mean? Or another foreign government. So that's an interesting angle. Now we do have a couple of stories here regarding just recent media hacks. Now I sort of stepped on the Fox News one, but there is one that just came out just yesterday about the Washington Post. You want to chat about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Washington Post had their job site was compromised on June 27th and 28th.
Yeah.
And 1.27 million accounts were compromised and leaked.
1.27 million IDs and email addresses.
So apparently that's username and email address, and they say it didn't include password or any other personal information. Which is kind of weird. Like, did they have a database that was username and email address, but nothing else?
Maybe they kept the passwords in a separate location?
Possibly. No, I was just wondering if they were being overly semantical about it, and were saying that the password wasn't leaked; it was just a hashed version of the password.
Yeah, that could be.
But
or
they didn't say.
It could be that the jobs board system is run by like some third party a service, and so they don't have that part of the password or something.
It's entirely possible. So, yeah, they say it was just the username and the email address, and not like real name or where you live or your password.
Right.
So, but either way, they posted about it, and we have a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, kind of an interesting story, and if you are a subscriber to the Washington Post's job board, you might want to check that out. Might be something to look for. We had that website where you could go check to see if your email email and password had been leaked online through any of the recent attacks, and we have a link for that in the show notes. And of course, mine had been, which I found out on the show. So we asked people to do the same. And so I encourage people that are watching now, go check out the YouTube comments for TechSNAP 12 and the Jupiter Broadcasting page comments, because a few people also had a little surprise when they went to go check to see if their password had been compromised. So every week we cover another leak of this stuff. I mean, literally, it's like happens on a multiple times
basis.
It really is. And I'm just trying to wrap my brain around it really is more than just getting more attention, right? It really is happening more with like the anti-sec groups and things like that. I mean, it really does seem to be ramping up.
And I was looking at it the other week. There was, I think it's SANS Institute puts out a list of the top 10 security threats on the internet. And number 1 is obviously SQL injection. And then there's a couple other ones. And I think number 5 was what Dropbox did, is where the code doesn't implement authentication properly.
Oh.
And that's their system where somebody was able to gain access without needing credentials.
So a bug in the system rated number 5 on the top list, huh?
Yeah, and then number 10 was using passwords that weren't hashed or were hashed improperly.
Actually, I'm actually surprised I'm surprised it's that high on the list.
Well, it's a big deal, and it's something that.
Oh, I know. I mean, I'm surprised it's not like number 2.
There's no excuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, basically, to exploit that, you have to break into the system in some other way, but it's still a big security threat.
I was a big slacker. I emailed Groupon, by the way, yesterday about asking if their US version also stores their passwords in plain text. And, of course, that's not, I guess, enough time for them to get back to me. So maybe I'll have an answer for next week. But
an answer.
Do you want to cover anything else on this, or did you want to talk a little bit about maybe the future?
Just the last thing was the Fox News Twitter incident is being investigated by the Secret Service, because all incidents having to do with the president are investigated by the Secret Service rather than the FBI or some other.
They might have just picked the wrong bull to mess with on that one.
Quite possibly. And in show notes, we have links to a couple of different news coverages on it, the New York Times and the BBC, to get slightly different perspectives on what it means.
Now, I think, boys, talking about the Secret Service, I think all of this stuff is going to lead to, and I know I've said this probably too many times on the show now, but massive crackdowns from a government side to try to protect the economy, to try to protect security, to try to do this, try to do that. I think they're gonna. We've already seen stories this last week that they are essentially claiming that if it's a .com and I think a .net, they can exert ownership over it.
Because those are controlled by VeriSign, which is a U.S. company. They technically claim they have domain over them.
And Obama was just streaming live from Twitter yesterday, and he towards the end of the questions, he said, this was his words exactly. He said, I'm here as the president because of a scholarship. And then he was talking to Jack, the co-founder of Twitter or whatever, and he said, and you're sitting there because the federal government funded research that created the basics of the internet and made the internet possible. And I believe, and they're technically, I guess they're right, but I believe at a fundamental level, the U.S. federal government has a "we made it, we can break it" rule. And if they feel like they need to break it for the protection of the economy or the protection of security, I think we could see huge crackdowns coming.
Well, we've seen them try to pass legislation before about an internet kill switch.
Yeah. And the Protect IP Act, which is in a lot of ways allowing corporate interests that are closely tied with the federal government to institute shutdowns for any real DMCA violation they can come up with.
Yeah, and I think in the future we will see more and more countries working together to be able to circumvent the U.S. on, routing the internet.
Yeah.
Right now there are actually a lot of connections between Europe and North America actually go through Canada, because Newfoundland is a closer jumping off point for cross-Atlantic fiber. But a lot of the connections between countries end up going through the U.S. Actually, even in Canada right now, if you're going from somewhere in Canada to somewhere else, there's a good chance you'll end up going through the States to get there. Like sometimes even to get from the same city, right? You're going to your neighbor and you end up going through the States to get there because of the way the internet works. And I think we could see that starting to change, especially if the U.S. tries to exert more and more control over the internet.
Yeah, and then you have the security angle where as critical, like we talked about at the top of the show, critical services that are offered by the government can be attacked by cyber warfare. We've already seen the U.S. Pentagon step out and say, we're going to consider cyber warfare to be actual warfare, which will be eligible for a warlike response, physical or cyber. And we already see them setting themselves up for this.
Yeah, so the Pentagon came out and established their cyber warfare retaliation policy, basically saying that if foreign directed hackers can pose a significant risk and threat to U.S. nuclear reactors, subways, pipelines, and so on, just like a hostile country's military. So if a cyber attack causes significant disruption, like to the power grid or damage or death, then the attackers will be met with conventional armed force.
That's pretty intense.
And it's similar to the Pentagon's policy about weapons of mass destruction. For example, if some country uses chemical warfare or biological warfare against the U.S. or U.S. troops or interests, the U.S. doesn't have biological weapons or doesn't use them anyway. So their response is, we only have nukes, and so we will meet your chemical, biological, or nuclear attack with nuclear retaliation.
Right. That's pretty intense.
Right. And so in this, basically what they're saying here is, we will meet cyber warfare attacks that cause significant damage or death with conventional arms. So if you launch a cyber warfare attack against our power grid, we will bomb your power plants and cause the same damage back to you.
Now, that to me, if you're going to make that threat, you need to be able to back it up. So they seem to be positioning themselves to be ready to back it up. And B,
right. Well, basically what they're saying is they don't necessarily have the capability to counter the cyber warfare threat by hijacking the attacking country's infrastructure. So they will do it with bombs and missiles instead.
Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
Because
specifically because cyber warfare can be waged by entities other than governments.
Right, and it's such a technical and complicated thing to sort of track back and really identify and really come to the root of it.
Specifically, one of the stories a little bit later, we're going to talk about how it's possible to cover your trails so that nobody can know exactly where it came from.
Yeah, and so how are they supposed to be able to know to make? They'd have to have an informant or something. They'd have to have some sort of empirical evidence, and well, of course, we've seen governments act without empirical evidence, but you'd see it just seems like such a slippery slope for them to try to figure out and put that kind of technical responsibility in their hands.
But basically, I think the part of it is to set this policy so that, it's a deterrent. And just like nuclear missiles, right? The countries point them at each other and say, well, don't nuke us because we'll nuke you back. And so they're saying, don't hack us because we'll bomb you back.
Right. And meanwhile, they all will try to hack each other on behind the scenes to sort of get as much information.
But most of those attacks aren't meant to cause large disruptions because that would be an act of war. Whereas, right, it's like now, right? Spying happens all the time, and spies get caught, and it's like, well, that's not an act of war; it's just spying. But if sabotage happens, that's an act of war.
Right. But spying is done with the intent of being prepared for war.
Yes, but
I guess that's kind of like always making sure you're prepared for something.
Yeah, well, and also, if you know what the enemy troops are doing, then you're not worried that they're doing something else.
And you don't have to prepare for the wrong thing.
Like if you by spying, you know that the enemy troops are going to be doing maneuvers around the border at this date, you don't accidentally mistake that for them getting ready to invade.
Right, that's true. That's a good point. There is also sometimes just something benign like that. But you've got a story in here. Do you want to jump to this about sort of an indication that there's probably more of a Cold War going on than we realize?
I think so, yeah. I was reading, and there's a really good, really long article from The New Yorker here. But some of the stuff it talks about is how things keep advancing. And if you go back all the way about 10 years ago to 2001, the U.S. Navy was flying an EP-3E Ares II reconnaissance plane, which is basically a electronic snooper plane.
Oh.
It intercepts radar emissions and radio transmissions and satellite and all kinds of information, right?
Sure.
So that's, if you can analyze the enemy's radar signals, you can figure out how to better stealth or jam them. If you have their radio communications, you can hear what they're saying and break their encryption and things like that. Well, the Chinese weren't too pleased to having this plane snooping around, so they sent one of their fighters out to try to scare it off just by, buzzing it.
Yeah.
But they accidentally collided, and the plane was forced to land at a Chinese airbase. Because it has a crew of about 25 people, they didn't want to just.
Well, and to be clear, this is a big plane, right? I mean, I'm googling.
Yes.
I'm Google imaging it right now. This looks like one big mo.
It's based on the P-3 Orion anti-submarine patrol aircraft, but the main thing is it has really long range, and so it can stay in the air for a really long time. And yes, it has a full crew and a huge amount of electronics inside. So and you can see all the little antennas and stuff hanging out there.
It's got quite an array of gear on the back of it.
Yeah.
So Chinese pilots crashed into it on accident?
Yeah, and they were forced to land. Well, that's debatable.
Okay.
But specifically in that situation, the crew on board is supposed to erase all the hard drives and use, water, coffee, and fire axes to destroy all the equipment.
Yeah.
But they managed to erase the hard drives and stuff, but they didn't break all of the equipment and didn't completely destroy it all. And so the Chinese gained access to some of this equipment.
Oh.
And over the years, they've managed to reverse engineer some of it and use the communication gear that's on the plane for the plane to communicate with the Navy and some of the snooping information. And they were able to break some American communication links.
So they're able to use the code in that firmware or whatever it is on those things to get access to encrypted communication. So they're essentially using our own gear to decrypt communications.
Right. And so this happened over time, but nobody was very sure what was happening. A lot of people just assumed that the Chinese wouldn't be able to reverse engineer the NSA operating system that ran all the equipment because that had been erased. But a few weeks after President Obama was elected, the Chinese flooded their own communication links, ones that they knew were monitored by the NSA, with unencrypted copies of all kinds of communication intercepts from U.S. communication links.
As like a look what we can do.
Yeah, it's like, look what we have. We have all this data all these transmissions you thought were secure.
I like Bomber's idea. He says maybe the Bomber in the IRC chat room says that maybe the Chinese got in there and used SpinRite to restore the data. SpinRite's a disk recovery program that
I've used it.
It's so I guess, is there any other points on that other than just being kind of blown away by that? How that's just, and that's been going on for a couple of years. I mean, that was a couple of years ago.
Well, there's 10 years ago that started.
But
basically it's been ongoing, right? Like the plane crashed in 2001.
Oh, and then they released the unencrypted stuff.
But it took them a while to figure it all out. But they released information they had compromised in 2008.
Gotcha. Wow. Yeah. So it either took them a long time or they just have been listening for a very long time.
Right, and they were just like, well, the administration is changing, and maybe we just, send a little hello to Obama by saying, hey,
oh, that's totally what it was, wasn't it? Because it was when it was when he was elected or went into office or whatever.
When he first came into office, exactly.
Oh my gosh! What a little welcoming present! Oh my gosh!
It's a way, the governments are always trying to size up, especially when there's an administration change, they're trying to set the tone of what the future
they're pissing on. They're raising their leg and seeing how high they can piss on the tree.
Yeah, well, saying be careful what you say to us or what you say about us because we're listening.
Yeah. Huh. Wow. I wonder if then Obama calls up Bush and says, "Did you know?" Hey, by the way, now do you want to jump onto this next story, or do you want to cover anything else on that guy?
No, I think the next one is a really beefy one too.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so I'll let you set it up. So this is, I wanted to give credit to the Pentagon Warfare Act. That story was from the Wall Street Journal, because I want to try to credit people. And then the next story we're covering comes from NPR. And
was submitted by Raven Tiger on our
Reddit page. Yeah. And they're setting up the stage that cyber war is going to be, if I'm interpreting this article right, isn't going to be like these, like a big bomb attack. It's going to be these constant, subtle, constantly pounding on all these different angles kind of approach.
Yep.
That's what cyber war is going to turn into, or is, and it's going to evolve, continue to be.
It's going to be constant, and it's going to be, a lot of times, it's going to be very subtle.
Yeah.
So, for example, the attacks on RSA earlier this year, it was about March, I think, when it happened, were not conclusively linked to cyber warfare, right? We heard that they were compromised, but we didn't know by who.
Yeah.
And so it could have been a lone hacker who was just messing with RSA because they wanted to, or breaking in it because, it was a big target.
Yeah.
It could have been a small group, something like Anonymous or LulzSec, who was breaking in for their own goal, or it could have been an organized government attack on a security provider.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that RSA hack later on led to the compromise of secure systems at Lockheed Martin and a bunch of other U.S. arms manufacturers. And so that kind of militates towards thinking that it was, directed cyber warfare, right? They broke into RSA, and then, we didn't hear about anything about it for months.
Right.
And then it turns out that they managed to get the information they needed to compromise RSA secure tokens and make duplicates and break into Lockheed Martin.
It's not always a sure bet, but sometimes it seems like it could be a bit of a tell that if some big hack goes down and then nobody sort of posts a torrent or puts something on Pastebin or announces something on Twitter,
nobody claims responsibility, then
yeah, when it stays quiet, you almost start to wonder, oh, maybe that isn't just a hacktivist or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Could be a government, could be somebody who wants, and then when you see the targets, you start to kind of starts to sort of make sense, sort of fills in the backstory. But
yeah, and earlier this year we saw the compromise of a bunch of email accounts, especially ones belonging to government and military officials, right? And like we said, this is the type of reconnaissance that they would do to get information about these people. If you break into their email, what kind of stuff are they subscribed to, right? What newsletters,
right.
What kind of links, what emails do they open and click on?
Or what dirty laundry can we find?
Yeah. But knowing more about their habits and what they do would allow you to make a more effective phishing attack, right? If you know they open this newsletter and read it every week, you send a fake newsletter with links in it that,
Totally.
affect their system or whatever.
Yeah.
Or you can find out exactly what bank they use.
Or just you could even just pose as a trusted correspondent. You could see who they correspond with frequently and just pose as that person. And
like we talked about with Gmail and some other email providers, you can set up secondary access or forwarding and, gain access to this even after they've changed their password.
Yeah.
And, it gives you more and more information about this person, which you can later use to break into more secured systems.
The NPR piece here has some audio with it too, so if people want to go listen to that, they have a...
Oh, I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, up at the top, they have a little bit of audio people could go listen to. I don't know if they just read... it's 4 minutes. I don't know if they read the whole story.
Yes,
or
that's why it's a radio station. Of course, you're going to have audio.
I guess that makes sense. I kind of like the way they do that. So if you guys want to... If you're curious on NPR's take on that, we have the roundup to get to. So is there anything else you want to cover on the story?
Just 2 more points, but mostly many attacks go unnoticed.
Yeah.
Because either the perpetrators don't want to cause a scene, right? They break into the system and they don't want the administrator of the system to notice.
Right.
And they can keep that system to be used to launch future attacks from, like the Koreans did. Or, as we saw in the RSA hack, what they did was they broke into a web server at a popular ISP, The Planet, and they compromised it. And then when they broke into RSA, they didn't want to connect directly to RSA because that would leave a trail.
Right.
So they connected through that compromised web server to RSA to pull out all the information they wanted to steal. Then they got it off that web server, and then they destroyed that web server. They erased its hard drive and overwrote it and everything so that when it was traced back to that web server, there was no evidence left behind. And if you do that with like 2 or 3 chained in a row, then it virtually eliminates the possibility of somebody tracking it back to you.
Yeah, totally.
Unless there's some signature in the tools you used or something you left behind, right? Like if you left a virus behind infected on one of the machines,
right.
and in the source code there's comments in Chinese or something that might give it away.
Or your Twitter handle, hey, if you like this virus, hit me up on Twitter.
Yeah, and things like that. But if you're very careful about it, you can end up leaving no trail at all. That part kind of reminds me of this old computer game called Uplink, and you would literally, it had the War Games movie map, and you would bounce your connection off a bunch of servers. But
awesome.
You could bounce off any server, but if you bounced off a server you had compromised before, it had an extra ring around it, and it took the guys tracing you back a lot longer to trace through it.
I played a open source game like this. It was just kind of a 2D 8-bit kind of game.
This one's like OpenGL, and you can run it on Linux and Windows. It's available on Steam for like $5.
I'm totally, I think, is this I don't know if you have the live stream monitor up, but am I looking at the video of it here? Does this look right? I don't know what this is.
I think that's...
Well, anyways, so Uplink, huh? I'll check that out.
Yeah.
That sounds really cool.
It's cool. But basically, they would track you back 2 different ways. They would there'd be the active, like, telephone trace type thing, and going through a hack system meant it would take longer for them to trace through it. But once they did, then that machine was fixed and you didn't have it compromised anymore. And then also after you disconnected, they would do a passive trace where they'd be trying, going through logs and trying to track you down. So you would have to go back into the system you compromised and like erase the logs to break that trail.
Right. Which is more time to get caught and more time to set off other little trips and all that kind of stuff.
As you leveled up, like when you first leveled up, you only had a log analyzer that would leave, like in the log it would say it was deleted, and a hacker that's better than you could get a tool to undelete the log. And then later you got one that would leave it blank or something, and then later you get one that would put like a fake one in, and then the best one would erase it unretrievably.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
We should maybe we'll put a link in the show notes or something.
Yeah.
Do you want to move on to the roundup? Or do you have one more point?
And
yeah.
The last one was, in the past we've discussed similar tactics with island hopping. So when you break into a expert outside-facing system like a web server, a mail server, or the monitoring server, like we talked about, that's one of the good targets.
Yep.
Or even just the desktop of a secretary or something, because that's what happened in Canada, is they did a phishing attack kind of like with the RSA against lower-level people in the Ministry of Trade, and then eventually use that to compromise up to get into the computer of the actual minister and manage to export a bunch of trade data out to China. And it was literally cyber warfare against the Canadian government.
Wow. Trade data.
Yeah. And in this case, it was just about money. But, like it can be a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah, and and as long as the secretary had access to what you wanted, you're good. Or you can use her as a launching pad to get to something.
Yeah, as a launching pad to get into the computer that does have the data.
Yep.
And so you don't go advertising the fact that you broke into the secretary's computer. You sit quietly and slowly garner more and more information until you can jump over to this higher value target.
Yeah, there's always a moment of opportunity. Patience is a virtue when you get in like that. And something always comes up. And it usually is something that is just bad design, a mistake, something that was put in place to make something easier, and you can exploit it.
Or a lot of time, it's exploiting people, right?
Yeah.
Like we talked with the USB sticks, or with phishing, or remember with the RSA thing, it was a virus. It was a flash 0-day exploit embedded in an Excel file that was emailed in and was even identified as spam, but the employee went in there, dug it out of their spam folder, and opened it because it had their manager's name on the from field.
Well, and exactly. And that's why taking a secretary accounts over is just as valuable as well, because you could send out that same kind of attachment to somebody who has higher level privileges, and it's coming from a trusted account who would normally be probably sending that type of information.
Exactly. Most of the times, directives you get from your boss don't come from your boss, but from his administrative assistant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes those assistants are more computer literate than your boss. It depends.
So I guess what we're saying is secretaries really are the cause of all IT security issues.
Every machine in the company has to be secure, not just
Yeah, that really is the truth.
ones that deal with secure data.
Yeah, that really is the truth. What do you think? You ready for the roundup now?
Yep.
All right. Now, the first story in the roundup we already covered, so we can skip over that. I'll take this next one here. because the fast style that we are here is the roundup is kind of we run through headlines that didn't quite make it as a main story, but we still wanted to include in the show. And the first one came, from myself, actually. I found this one here, but Anonymous hacks Apple servers and pastes usernames and password hashes. I guess it wasn't like a super bad exploit, but they got in and they got some stuff. And if you want to read about that,
it's like their MySQL hashed passwords.
Yeah,
just because of the way they're formatted there.
So you might want to go check the list because it's all posted up online now.
The list is quite short, but it mostly looks like all internal stuff.
Yeah,
but
there was like a handful of actual usernames, really, because it did all look like internal Unix accounts and stuff.
Anybody with Bitcoining video card could crack that list of passwords pretty quickly.
I might have a couple of those, but I'll save that for the Bitcoin Blaster segment. All right, Alan, you want to take the next? The
next one was another good article from Scientific America, The Fog of Cyber Warfare, and it kind of asks, what are the rules of engagement and how do you fight a war when there's no borders?
Right.
And it's another good article, and that was again submitted through Reddit by Raven Tiger.
The whole borders issue is going to be a real stinker.
Yeah, and also when you have these individual people or small groups being able to basically wage war, and how do you retaliate against them? It's a similar question to terrorism, right? With terrorism is like it's not the state, so how do you counter them?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Now here's another story from the Roundup that's about another set of information getting leaked to the Chinese, and this one comes from Chicago. Exchange secrets were leaked to China. A 10-year employee allegedly stole trade secrets and proprietary source code on the trading systems that run the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong.
Yep.
And they passed it on to China. A 10-year employee. You'd think that would be somebody who could be pretty trusted. Wow.
Right. And the scary thing about this is he did it because his plan was to go to China and start a company that builds stock exchanges. But that same information can be used to break into the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and to disrupt it, right? And again, this is in Tom Clancy's book, Debt of Honor, is the Japanese a segment of the Japanese government wages war against the states by destroying the stock exchange.
I didn't mean the employee was 10 years old. I meant he'd worked for the employer for 10 years. Chatter was giving me a hard time. I'll cover this last... Oh, wait. I forget who's up. But here in the Roundup, I just wanted to mention that also if you are a Do you use VFTPD, Alan, on BSD?
I don't use the VS one. On 99% of my servers, FTP is off anyway.
Yeah.
On the few that it isn't, it's either the built-in BSD one or Pro FTPD.
There's a link in the show notes here about a backdoor getting into
so VSFTPD is very popular on a lot of Linux distributions, though.
Yes.
And but basically, one of their official mirror or subversion repository, somehow somebody got the official copy, the official tarball to include a backdoor in it, and that's what even a lot of binary packages on different distributions are built from, and so it could affect a lot of people, and I don't know in this case how thoroughly they broke in.
Yeah.
I don't know when they published that. I don't know if they put out hashes, like MD5 hashes, and specifically GPG signatures, because the GPG signature is the one they can't fake, right? If it's just an MD5 hash, then when you put up the tarball with the backdoor in it, you just make a new MD5 hash.
Yeah.
But if it's a GPG signature, you need the private key to be able to sign that file.
Yeah. It's pretty common just to do the MD5.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't check even the MD5.
Yeah, I don't. I never do.
Right? I never do. Yeah, and so it's very easy for somebody to slip a virus in there. Backdoor in a service that's running as root, and that's, a huge number of boxes you can take over.
Oh, yeah. And it's got a nice connection to the internet, generally. So next story in the Roundup is the Dropbox change of services. Do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah. So Dropbox changed their terms of service to grant them a very broad copyright license over all of your files.
Yeah.
It's very similar to, honestly, the same, almost the exact wording appears in YouTube and Facebook and so on.
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, it basically means that they can use whatever data you put in there. For Dropbox, that's a little worse than for, say, YouTube. Like on YouTube, you know that it's being published and that YouTube's going to make money off of it. Dropbox, I normally don't mean for my files to be published.
Yeah.
It depends, but, it's just another reason why you might not want to look at it.
Yeah, it's something that definitely.
And
it's on
apparently they've updated their terms of service again this morning.
Yes, I haven't read it yet though, but
I haven't read it either.
yeah. Last story in the roundup before we jump into the Bitcoin Blaster segment is Cisco came out with a story that targeted phishing attacks, things where you direct specific people, earned hackers $150 million last month alone.
Yeah, and they're saying that it's starting to supersede spam because when it's that targeted and you're getting...
And I think they're lumping in like that antivirus 2010 thing where it gets you to enter your credit card to clean it up, and they're lumping all that into this category too, but...
I don't think so. I think that...
oh, okay. I thought Cisco... I thought they had labeled that as a phishing attack, but I know that in this article here they have it as email. I'm not sure if it's... Yeah, I'm not sure if... I think Cisco might be counting it, but the article isn't covered. I'm not... I haven't read it. That's why it's in the roundup segment.
But I think that scareware makes more money than that already.
Yeah, probably, huh? Yeah.
And there was a big crackdown on that recently. I don't know if we actually... I think that we covered that in a roundup story the other week.
Yeah. Now, a couple of stories out of the Bitcoin Blaster before we get out of here this week is the first thing I probably is kind of getting a little bit of controversy right now is there was a lawyer out there that is trying to attempt to trademark Bitcoin as a trademark term.
Yeah, and he's trying to use the fact that he wrote a letter on like June 23rd as the first use of the term Bitcoin. And one thing I would say is that the author's original, what do you call it? Papers you write in university.
The whole spec he wrote up about it, the whole sort of proposal or whatever.
Yeah, that from like 2008 would have been the first, published use of the word Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So hopefully that doesn't go anywhere. And if it does, it just proves how broken the trademark and copyright system is.
No kidding, right? But I hope you're right. I hope it doesn't go anywhere. It's kind of a D-bag thing to do. This is kind of cool for you Android users out there. There is a Bitcoin payment app. Now, I don't really know about the security of this thing or the details, but the whole idea is that you could take your Android phone, and you might even have like a QR code on there, and you could send money to people, or people could send you money from Android apps.
Yes. Part of the problem with this is to do that normally with a Bitcoin wallet, you have to have an updated copy of all the blocks.
Yeah.
And so you would require a constant internet connection. This service doesn't. So that means it's using a cloud wallet somewhere.
Right, which must be keeping track of the blocks.
There's no details about who hosts this, where it is, how safe it is, and how the authentication works.
It is open source, though, so that's good.
Okay, but I would say that I wouldn't use this.
Yeah, I agree, because even if all intentions are good and it's open source and you can see the code, I would probably, at least I'd put it in this category. I wouldn't, first of all, there's no real compelling reason to use it at this point, but I wouldn't really probably want to be one of the first adopters, because they could get compromised, they could get attacked, even with all the best of intentions.
A big part of this is that, it's saying that things don't have to be done right away. Like if you don't have a connection, it'll accept it and then verify it later. And you kind of need to verify it quite soon, right? You want, for a transaction to avoid the double spend thing, blocks need to be added on top of your transaction to prevent it from being changed, right? Because once things are on top of it, you'd have to fork the tree and add more blocks on top faster than the other chain.
Right.
And so if your transaction isn't, if you're not verifying your side of the transaction quickly enough, then it's possible somebody could send the money somewhere else and it would end up going there instead of to you.
Yeah, so they
So there's a lot of issues with trying to do it offline, right? Bitcoin is very much a distributed system that it needs the internet connection.
So probably the other big story, right, in Bitcoin before we wrap up is the fact that when we started recording this, it looks like both BTC Guild and Deepbit are back up now, but when we started recording this, they were under denial of service attacks.
And I would say that they still are, in the fact that Deepbit is still less than 25% of the global hash rate, and it was closer to 50 on a regular.
They seem to take a beating every time they start to notch their way up. This happened last time. This happened last time they got that high.
Yeah, last night Deepbit broke the 5,000 gigahashes mark. And right now, they're only at about 2,000. And they were actually down to 0 a couple of hours ago.
Yeah.
BTC Guild has 1 or 2 of their servers back up out of, they did have 5 or 6.
I've been on myself on, my pool has been Mount Red for quite a while. I switched over to Deepbit for a little while to try out a Bitcoin monitoring service where it gives you charts of your overall. It basically uses the DeepBit API to pull in all your stats and then graphs. And that's how I found out about the DDoS attack. Is I got a text message saying your workers have fallen below their threshold, and so I knew just to go out and turn off my workers for a while because they're just burning themselves up. But I wanted to show something before we wrap, Alan, in the Bitcoin segment. Is last week I talked about it just really briefly, I think, on the show. I think I meant to at least. But this week my my Atom board came in, and this sucker is it was $99 on Newegg, and it is a Atom motherboard with a PCI Express slot, and it takes a standard power supply. It's a mini.
And it's passively cooled.
It's passively cooled, no CPU fan, and of course Atom's super low watt. It's a dual 1.6 gigahertz. It's a dual core, and I'm going to try putting a USB thumbstick, no spinning media, and I'm going to try doing I'm going to try using Linux Coin off of the USB media to mine with this guy, and kind of curious to see how that's going to work out. So maybe by the time next week comes around in the Bitcoin Blaster segment, I'll have that guy up and running. And if I do get Linux Coin rocking, I will probably do a segment on how I got the whole USB bootable media working on Linux Action Show. So that's cool too. Little win-win there, eh, Alan?
Yep.
All right. Is there anything else we want to cover before we wrap this guy up?
No, I just ask people to send in more questions for next week's question and answer episode.
Yep. Again, we're doing a double dose of the Q&A, so send those over to TechSNAP@JupiterBroadcasting.com. And, of course, you're always welcome to join us live at 1 p.m. on Thursdays over at jblive.tv, and that's at Pacific. So if you want to convert it to your own time, go over to jupiterbroadcasting.com/calendar, and we have a converter link over there. Okay.
Yep. So
all right,
2000 UTC.
What is it?
2000 UTC is when the show is live.
There you go. That's probably 10 times more helpful than me saying Pacific time. So thanks.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks for watching this week's episode of TechSNAP, and we'll see you next week.